Let me also thank TD Bank, because in addition to funding a lot of what Park People does in this conference, they were actually very generous funders of the Trust for Public Land. In fact, they're funding the installation of 8 fitness zones in Miami. And you say, Miami, why do they need fitness zones? These are in the poorest sections of Miami. If you saw the movie Moonlight, which I hope you did, it's a beautiful movie. It takes place in Liberty City, which is a very poor neighborhood of Miami. That's where we're building a number of these fitness zones in Liberty City, thanks to this grant from TD Bank. And also, we are making them stormwater capture or green infrastructure fitness zones, which is a first. So it really fits in with the whole extraordinary environmental program that TD Bank has to offer. And I want to say thank you to Karen Clark-Whistler, who's the Chief Environmental Officer, and Joe Doolin. Let me also thank Dave Harvey and Park People. I got to meet Dave about, I guess, 5 or 6 years ago, maybe at the City Parks Alliance in New York, I think. And we've been friends since. Because of him, at least partly because of him, I've been to Toronto twice. I will show some pictures of some of my favorite parks in Canada with a little bit of an emphasis on Toronto, simply because I've been there more often than other Canadian cities. Thank you, Ann Charlton, for hosting this and for having one of the great park systems in North America. Really, 8,000 hectares of parks in a city of 1.5 million, almost 1.5 million, is an extraordinary amount of parkland. It's really huge. Huge. Speaking of huge, I'd like to thank the Canadian Border Services Agency for allowing me in yesterday. I have to say, it takes principles to let in refugees from unstable regimes under the influence of hostile foreign powers. I hope they let me back in. Seriously, take our president, please. He may not respect the American Constitution, but possibly he'll respect yours. That's all I have to say about that. All right, why don't we get started before I get in any further trouble. If you see Russian people following me, please let me know. I work for the Trust for Public Land now. You got my bio from Janie. Thanks very much. And I'm going to talk to you about interesting trends in parks, primarily in the United States, which is where the Trust for Public Land works. But we also pay attention to some international trends in parks. And I also have this long history in New York City parks, which was really a lot of fun. The Trust for Public Land works all across the United States of America. There you can see a map showing where we've worked in literally thousands of places. And it's really a combination of large-scale land conservation and making parks and cities, or helping make parks and cities. And most important, in helping develop policies and advocacy, and in particular, finding money for parks. And I'm going to talk to you about where you find money for parks. There's a mine in Utah, which is, and one of the reasons, and you know, I can probably get away without having a lavalier mic. I think I'm good, so thank you. One of the best ways to talk about parks to decision makers, to your mayors, to your governors, to your councilors, to your ministers, is to talk about the multiple benefits of parks. Because it used to be we in the parks world talked about parks, and they say, oh, that's very nice. We'll get to you as soon as we've taken care of police, fire, sanitation, water, housing, economic development, et cetera, et cetera. At the very end of the list, if there's some money left over, oops, I'm sorry, we have to cut your budget. So that's the way it used to be in parks. Those days are gone forever, because we now understand that parks convey multiple benefits, and it's really incumbent upon us to speak in the language of multiple benefits. And what do we mean by multiple benefits? So this happens to be, this is product placement, sorry, this happens to be a Trust for Public Land project. And it's what used to be euphemistically known as a New York City schoolyard. And the schoolyard has been transformed into a community playground. It used to be, the schoolyard was a sheet of asphalt, and you'll see more about this later. And Parks do extraordinary things. First of all, we all know, and I'm probably preaching to the converted about their environmental benefits, or the ecosystem services, if you want to get wonky, that vegetations in parks and even along trails improve air quality. They remove air pollutants such as carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, dust, and fine particles of sulfur dioxide. And the vegetation in parks also helps to mitigate urban heat island impacts, something increasingly important during times of climate change, and I can say that because I'm in Canada. I even say it in the United States. We can estimate the cost savings of pollutants not entering the atmosphere using U.S. Forest Service models, and U.S. Forest Service has been surprisingly progressive in terms of monitoring the impact of trees in urban settings. And we can estimate the cost of cities, the savings of cities, it's millions and millions of dollars. And the value of parks in providing ecosystem services, including capturing stormwater, and more about that later. This is a park, this is a sort of a series of park views sort of showing, in particular, stormwater capture. And you see West Riverfront Park in Nashville, Tennessee. On the bottom left, a green alley project the Trust for Public Land is doing in Los Angeles. And on the right side, you can see a cutaway sort of view of one of those New York City schoolyards showing a synthetic turf field installed where there used to be asphalt, which basically serves as a big green sponge. Not green as in natural grass, but green as in stormwater absorption. Each of these schoolyards, by the way, now absorbs all the rain that falls on them, which is in some cases, over 1 million gallons of stormwater a year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but there are 1,000 schools in New York City. So 1,000 schoolyards times anywhere from 500 to 1 million gallons, you can start to do the math. I can't. But the very extraordinary, sometimes active, sometimes passive role of capturing stormwater is so important in all cities to put that stormwater back into the ground. Parks, as you know, are also very important for public health. The Rand Corporation did a study for us. We've been installing fitness zones across America. We've done over 100 now, including 40 in Los Angeles County. And they find that 50% of all vigorous exercise, that is the hard, healthy exercise that's going to make you and keep you healthy, takes place in a nearby neighborhood park. And how do we define nearby? We define nearby very simply, half a mile or 10-minute walk. So the 10-minute walk to a park is our national sort of campaign goal, that every resident of a city in America should have a park within a 10-minute walk. An earlier speaker mentioned that 50% of Canadians now live in cities. In America, it's 85% of Americans live in cities or nearby suburbs, and that's a number that's growing. So the rural areas are shrinking, the cities are growing, and some growing very fast indeed. I learned recently from Ann that the population of Calgary has doubled in the last 30 years. Doubled. That's extraordinary. That's extraordinary growth. You see the buildings popping up in downtown Toronto like mushrooms after rainfall. We really need to include parks, not just as nice amenities that make neighborhoods pleasant, and by the way, that's really important, but for the public health and the environmental services they provide. Parks also provide important economic benefits. The Trust for Public Land has something called the Center for City Park Excellence, and we have economists who work for us. We've done a series of economic value studies of park systems for cities. By the way, everything that I'm going to tell you about that we do is available on our website for free. So you can download these studies of the economic value. This is our most recent study of the parks of San Jose, California. And you can see some of the numbers up there. But what we do is we look at all of the important values that parks bring to cities, including the stormwater capture, the urban heat island reduction, the health benefits, and there are these very real estate value benefits. Virtually every study I've seen, and I've seen probably half a dozen now, show a 20% increment in the value of property directly across the street from a park, and then it starts to step back as you step away from the park. So at about 5% a block. So compared to similar real estate, the real estate next to park is 20% more valuable. That's really important to know, because that's when you start to talk about your tax base. When you can talk about your tax base, elected officials start to perk up and listen. So let me just take you quickly through some exemplary Canadian parks. My apologies if I didn't include your cities or your parks. These are just some of the ones I've heard about or know about or I have actually visited. This is one of my favorite parks. I believe this is Corktown Common in Toronto. It's also happens to be by one of my favorite landscape architects, Michael Van Valkenburg Associates. Michael and his team, which is based in Brooklyn, designed Brooklyn Bridge Park in New York City. And has anybody been to New York City and seen Brooklyn Bridge Park? Raise a hand. In my view, they're kind of like the Frederick Law Olmsted of the 21st century. Really terrific landscape architecture firm. And if you haven't been to this Corktown Common Park, you should go see it. It's only 18 acres, so relatively small, but it plays a really important role. And particularly it plays an important role in keeping flooding from coming in from the Don, and has built-in protection that protects up to the 500-year flood. Frankly, we should start designing for the 1,000-year flood, but the 500 years is pretty good. It's also a very beautiful park in a fast-growing section, a formerly industrial brownfield section of Toronto. Another one of my favorite parks, this is a really sexy park, Sugar Beach on the waterfront in Toronto. If somebody had said to me, I'm going to design a park for you which has big pink umbrellas in it, I'd say no thanks. But this really works. And it's got a water play feature. It's got these movable furniture, which is a really nice thing if you can do it. And these beautiful pink umbrellas. It's called Sugar Beach because it's an old sugar factory, maybe a current sugar factory and warehouse directly across the water from it. And it's part of this really phenomenal revitalization of the Toronto waterfront that's going on. And this is another sort of thing for all of us to think about, and some of the questions alluded to this. Where do you find room for parks in fast-developing cities? We can't just say, oh, we'll find this nice natural area and put a fence around it now. You have to look at the formerly industrial areas, the wharfs, the warehouses, the train tracks, which I'll talk about more. The brownfields, the formerly maritime waterfront, which is no longer maritime in many cases, and Toronto, which has a terrific park access. The problem in Toronto is the downtown has grown so fast, there's literally no room left to make new parks. So you have to squeeze every little foot, and you'll see some examples of that. One of my favorite Frederick Law Olmsted parks, of course, is Mount Royal Park in Montreal. Just a terrific park. It's really the jewel of Montreal's terrific park system. And then talking about squeezing in a park, this underpass park in Toronto, this again is the sort of future of park space in very highly developed cities. It's looking at those marginal spaces, and it's making double or triple duty of existing public resources. So looking under the overpasses, under the elevated trains, under the elevated highways. And we made a terrible mistake here in North America where we ripped freeways and highways through the middle of our cities. And instead of really investing in mass transit, we can, in some cases we're taking those freeways down, as they've done in many cities, as they possibly should have done in Toronto. But in other cases, you make the best you can by animating a space under their freeway as they have done here. And I think this is just a terrific example of taking a negative space, making it positive, and squeezing in a park where we don't have room for a park. Sometimes parks happen because there are visionaries in the 19th century who thought about making parks, as in the spectacular Stanley Park of Vancouver. The cities that had the foresight to do this were really forward-thinking, and one of the North American cities that really thought about parks in the 19th century was Minneapolis, which created a terrific park system. But look at this. You could never do this today, assemble 1,000 acres and create a park in the downtown of a city. But it doesn't have to be a giant park. One of my favorite new parks is right here in Calgary. I say favorite, I haven't been there yet. It's my favorite that I view from a distance and read about. It turns out a couple of firms that I've worked with, terrific landscape architecture firms that I've worked with in the United States, also worked on this, Civitas, which is a Denver-based firm, and W Landscape Architecture. And from everything I've seen, what a wonderful thing to have in a downtown area, in the middle of your river, a park on an island where kids can go wade in the water and interact with the rocks, and they've sort of recreated the natural habitat there. So, if anybody's feeling adventurous and wants to go bathe in the water, I'll go with you. So what are some of the trends in urban park design? This happens to be, this beautiful picture that looks like a rendering is a real picture. This is Newark, New Jersey. Now, New Jersey, if you've ever been there, is known as the Garden State. But if you've been to Newark and other cities near New York City, it's not exactly garden-esque. And the Passaic River flows through downtown Newark, and we just finished, the Trust for Public Land, just finished building the first waterfront park in Newark because everything was given over to industry. And in fact, this was a brownfield that's on the edge of an EPA Superfund site. But the multifunctionality of public spaces is so important as you go forward to make parks. Again, getting back to West Riverfront Park in Nashville. Nashville had terrible flooding, and they could have done one of two things. They could have built giant levees, which is a traditional U.S. Army Corps of Engineers response to flooding, or you could make multifunctional infrastructure. Create a park that functions as a big levee, which is what this park does. And it's a terrific park. It's got a major amphitheater in it. Anybody know Nashville's city motto? What they call it? They call it Music City. It's the home of the Country Western Hall of Fame. It's also the home of, by the way, go to Nashville. If you go to Nashville, visit the Johnny Cash Museum. It's awesome. It's so good. That's right in downtown. It's right next to the honky-tonk area in downtown, as it should be. Anyway, Music City, of course, created a great new music venue. So they have this huge amphitheater, but it's also a functional park, and it happens to be a flood barrier, and it's got a giant stormwater capture system built into it. So that's really the quintessence of multifunctional infrastructure. Miami, again, looking at how do you make the best of a bad situation, Miami doesn't have a great park system and has got a terrible bicycling infrastructure. You take your life into your own hands if you ride a bike in Miami. And when I was visiting Miami 5 years ago, I noticed this elevated commuter rail. I looked at the space underneath it. I thought, what a great place for a greenway underneath this elevated rail line. It turned out they were already 2 steps ahead of me, and this project called the Underline is well underway. It's to create a 10-mile-long linear park and greenway underneath the elevated commuter rail in Miami. It's being designed by Jim Corner Field Operations, who also designed another interesting transformative project in New York called the High Line. I'm not going to show pictures of the High Line. And here's a little close-up above, and there's a before and after of PS 261 in Brooklyn. There on the top left, you see a typical New York City schoolyard. That is, it has all the ambiance of a prison yard. It's usually an acre of asphalt. If you're lucky, the asphalt is smooth and not all cracked up. It's usually got a 16-foot prison fence, hurricane fence around it. And that's it. That's where the kids get to run around at recess. So, and the worst part about this is in many neighborhoods, it's the only open space, but they used to lock them up at 3 o'clock and keep them closed weekends and summers. So the Trust for Public Land invented this idea of going to the schools and saying, hey, if you let us transform it into a nice playground for your kids, we'll do that, but the quid pro quo is you have to open it to the community. Now, in most cities, it's standard that the school playgrounds and schoolyards stay open to the public. It's not in New York and in other cities. This became a model, and under Mayor Bloomberg, we transformed 250 schoolyards into community playgrounds based on the Trust for Public Land model. The latest model is doing stormwater capture. So we're getting money from the water department, green infrastructure funding, to build in the stormwater capture systems. And here you can see one of those stormwater capture schoolyards. By the way, the Trust for Public Land does this as a public-private partner. We do the community engagement, we hire the landscape architect, we design it, we bid out the construction, we oversee the construction, and we deliver it using a combination of public and private funding. So that's another thing to think about. Allowing a nonprofit partner to do heavy-duty construction in public space. It takes a lot of gumption to do that on both sides. One of my favorite sort of impossibly cool projects is the low line. By the way, everything's called line now. Ever since the High Line, everything's called a line. I'm drawing a line on that from now on. This is an underground trolley station. The trolleys went out of business in the 1940s in New York, unfortunately, and this is right by the Manhattan Bridge. And this underground trolley station is being transformed into an underground park, where they're going to capture sunlight from above and channel in below and allow you to have plants. And Underground park seems like a crazy idea, maybe not in a Canadian winter. So I urge you to sort of study the low line. And then one of the biggest transformations of a formerly industrial waterfront into a sort of park-like, not completely a park, but a park-like area is taking place in Seattle, where the entire downtown Seattle waterfront is being transformed. First, they're taking down what they call the Alaska Skyway, which is a double-decker freeway. It's being taken down as we speak. Well, actually, not as we speak. They're building a tunnel first to absorb the traffic that used to be on the highway. So they're taking that down. You'll have a connection between downtown Seattle and the waterfront, which has been missing for a long time, and a big new sort of green boulevard with enhanced bikeways and connections up to the Pike Place Market and all kinds of performance spaces, and finally connecting the city of Seattle with its waterfront. We, the Trust for Public Land, kind of jump-started that when we worked with other Seattle nonprofits to create Olympic Sculpture Park, which was an old gas tank farm converted now into one of the great sculpture parks of North America, in a very complex environment because we had to get across the train tracks, we had to get across a roadway, and create a park that bridged the train tracks and the roadway and connected with the now emerging Seattle waterfront. Another transformative project, and let's talk about the what do you do with old rail lines? It is a conundrum. It's a difficulty. Rail lines have a lot of power. They do in the United States too, but it's not immutable. And where there is a will, there is a way. Here in New York City, there is a abandoned Long Island Railroad line that runs through the heart of Queens. It's 3.5 miles long. And the Trust for Public Land is seeking to turn that into something we're calling the Queensway. Note we avoided the word line. We call it a way instead. So the Queensway would take this abandoned rail line, which has been abandoned for 60 years, and convert it into a 3.5-mile linear park. Here's a current condition of the Queensway. This is one of the bridges going through it. Isn't it amazing how you stop running a train and nature just takes over? It's extraordinary. And this isn't even the deep woods that we have there. And so for about $140 million, which is a bargain, because the High Line has cost $240 million so far for 1/7 the acreage, we can create this linear park and greenway and have the first sort of north-south bike path through Queens. And these are some images of what it could look like. So I think that there are a few responses to the rail lines. The active rail lines can be bridged over. A terrific example of that, there are many such examples, but a terrific example would be in New York City in the 1930s, there was a rail line along the west side along the Hudson River, and Robert Moses, who did great park work, built a giant concrete box over this rail line and put Riverside Park on top of it. You cannot tell there are trains there. And it was at sort of a sort of Egyptian public works scale, like building, the temples. And they built this giant, of course, you could do landfill in those days into the river. They put ball fields and highways in the river. But most important, they built a big box with a park over it, which led to extraordinary property values, but also most important, created a really important park. So you can put boxes, bridges, decks over highways, freeways, and railroad lines. And if you're really not going to use that rail line, come on, let's turn it into multi-use park and greenway. There are so many benefits. Here's a good example. City of Santa Fe, New Mexico had an old rail yard. They didn't need it anymore. In its heyday in the 1920s, it was very busy, but then it fell into disrepair and became a brownfield. So the Trust for Public Lands worked to create Santa Fe Rail Yard Park. And the transformation of rail yards and rail lines into parks is really happening all across North America. It's particularly busy in the United States with the rails to trails conversions. There have been thousands of miles of abandoned rail lines converted into trails, and there's a whole Rails to Trails Conservancy dedicated exclusively to helping local communities turn abandoned rails into trails. So you can go to the Rails to Trails Conservancy and find examples of how to do this kind of thing. So how do you pay for all of this? There, in fact, is not a secret mine in Utah that you can dig. Well, there is, but we don't have access to it, especially under the new administration. But one of the ways that money comes along for land conservation, park creation, park maintenance is through voter measures. I don't know if you can do that in Canada. But there are all kinds of ways to put a measure on the ballot to voters and say, can we do the following to create money for parks, for conservation, for environmental purposes? And it can be a sales tax. It can be a property tax. It can be just a general tax levy. There are all kinds of different mechanisms. We've recently been studying urban park financing mechanisms. There are at least 50 different kinds of mechanisms that we can use in the United States to find and create money for parks, and it really does work. This is a map showing just 10 years of land conservation votes. Over the last 10 or 15, well, actually over the lifetime of our work, we have created about 70 billion with a B dollars in conservation and park creation money through these things we call land votes or measures or things like that. And how does that work? So for example, just in the last election, not all the news was bad last November. There were 86, as you can see, 86 park conservation and restoration measures nationwide with an almost 80% passage rate. And when you think about it, you're asking people in many cases to tax themselves a little bit extra. It created $6.3 billion for parks and open space. It was a big return to pre-recession levels. Perhaps the most impressive one was in Los Angeles County. And LA, as you know, is not a particularly great place for parks. It's not even a great place to drive. But they're really aggressively pursuing a more enlightened strategy. And voters voted 73 to 27% to tax themselves, to pay more property tax, which is extraordinary. It's going to create $1.8 billion in new funding, which will be distributed out to all the parks, all the cities of LA County. It's a huge win, because you had to have a supermajority to get this across, and the last time we tried it, we lost. Similarly, in Boston, voters voted 74% to 26% to adopt the Community Preservation Act, again, something which generates money. All across America this happened. It happened in all three measures in Florida. And interestingly, it's not a red or blue issue. In counties that voted for Trump, there was a 71% passage rate. In counties that voted for Hillary Clinton, there was an 81%. So there's a bit of a difference, but not a huge difference. Red or blue Americans vote green when it comes to conservation, which is pretty astounding. And we hope that people understand and respect that. Another really important thing, a trend now in America, is looking at issues of park equity. So it's all well and good to say we're investing in parks, but are you investing in parks for the people who need them most? And there are a couple of cities in the United States that are doing some really groundbreaking work in looking at the issues of equity and who really needs the park and who's not getting the services. And historically, underserved communities in general have not gotten the services they deserve. So San Francisco Recreation Parks did some very sophisticated work looking at where's the lack of equity within the city of San Francisco, and looking at issues such as age, like high youth and senior populations, asthma rates, low birth weights, low education, linguistic isolation, poverty, and unemployment. They look at all those factors, and then they come up with, how do we balance for that? And they created what they call equity zones. So 38% of all parks, and they looked at these equity zones and decided how can we invest better in the equity zones. And then these tables demonstrate how parks within equity zones compare to parks located outside of equity zones. It turns out San Francisco is doing a pretty good job, but they can do a better job. So they created a plan for investing in underserved neighborhoods, and also looking at, there's another form of equity, which is geographic equity, like do you have the park with a 10-minute walk? Turns out San Francisco is the best of American cities in terms of access, physical access. 99% of San Francisco residents live within a 10-minute walk of a park or playground, which means they have lots of small parks. But it's a pretty good number. We're pretty certain they'll get to 100% very soon, and we measure that through something called Park Score. And to combat the inequities, San Francisco is undertaking a number of programs to address issues like deferred maintenance, programming, capital investment, acquisition, developments. Very similarly, the city of Minneapolis where they're coming under some criticism. Again, a terrific park system, according to our standards, the #1 park system in America, based on a number of metrics, which you can see at our Park Score website. But they took a very good self-analytical look and looked at community characteristics, at racially concentrated areas of poverty, at neighborhood population density, youth population, and they looked at crime statistics. Because if you won't, it doesn't matter if there's a park nearby. If it's dangerous, you won't go there. And then they look at the park characteristics, the asset condition, the age, and proportionate value. And then they create this formula and say, they went to the city council and got $250 million over 20 years to invest, particularly in neighborhood parks in underserved neighborhoods, based on very specific criteria. They created this program called Closing the Gap. And in New York City, 3 interesting programs. One is the Community Park Initiatives, where the current Parks Commissioner, Mitchell Silver, looked at 70 small community-based parks that had not had significant capital investment over the last 20 years and created a program to invest millions and millions of dollars in renovating these neighborhood parks. The other sort of interesting thing that Mitchell Silver is looking at, which is not so much equity-based as how do the parks function as parts of the community. And he's created a program called Parks Without Borders. That is looking at these parks, which we kind of designed to defend, as for like defense, with fences around them and lighting. They're kind of scary looking from the outside because we're trying to keep people out. He thought, why are we trying to keep people out? Why don't we try to let them in? So they've incorporated these Parks Without Border principles now into a number of parks. And they went to the communities and said, which parks would you like to see become more porous? Lower fences, greater visibility, and letting the green stretch out into the community. And so one example is a park in Queens called Traverse Park, where they're taking down the 12-foot high fence and opening up the park boundaries and integrating the park into the neighborhood and adding new sort of sitting amenities. Interesting, too, it's not always a win, because some communities just say, I really don't want those people coming into this playground overnight and leaving behind the stuff they leave behind. So in some neighborhoods, there's been opposition to taking down the fences, lowering the fences. But it's I think, an interesting idea. And one of the ways they sort of figure out which neighborhoods they should do this in is by really going to the community. I want to get back to something that Dave highlighted. The #1 thing you should think about as you think about how to renovate a park is, what's the community thinking about this, and what's their interest and input. So finally, I want to talk about how you do things through public-private partnerships. And public-private partnerships are still relatively new to Canada, but they've been around now in city parks since roughly 1980, so going on 40 years. Really, the grandmother of all public-private partnerships is Central Park. And Central Park, the Central Park you see today is not the Central Park that I encountered, particularly as a teenager and young adult. And this is a couple of articles in the New York Times in 1980, sort of writing about the New York City park system, a tattered remnant of its past. And it was true. It was awful, really neglected, falling apart. And that included our flagship parks like Central Park and Prospect Park. New York City had abandoned its public realm because of budget cuts and really a failure of the public imagination. So this is a boathouse at the north end of Central Park that I knew when I first started working at the Parks Department. Abandoned, burnt out, covered with graffiti, the lake full of garbage. This is Central Park. The nation's first great purpose-built public park, the model for all parks that followed. But something happened as the city was recovering from one of its great fiscal crises. Mayor Koch was elected mayor. He appointed a very imaginative Parks Commissioner, Gordon Davis, who linked up with a very smart city planner named Betsy Barlow. Betsy Barlow was appointed park administrator of the park with a very holistic approach to the park. And she decided to bring in a public-private partnership model similar to museums, cultural institutions, universities, hospitals, and so on, that is having a board of citizens to help create a continuity and focus on the park. So the Central Park Conservancy was created, which is where you have a park administrator who reports both to the Parks Department and to the board of the Central Park Conservancy, a board of private citizens, which also includes board members named by the mayor and other public officials. And they also created a very important, they created a master plan for the revival of the park, both a programmatic and physical master plan. So this was the sheep meadow that I used to play touch football on in the 1960s and 70s, and you would come home bleeding from playing here. And then a lot of good things happened in 1979. This new commissioner did a lot of really innovative things. One of them was creating something called the Urban Park Rangers, which was sort of designed to get people back into the park and providing some guidance for how to use it. That, by the way, is me in the middle, pointing. That's not a joke. That's me in 1979, and that was the sheep meadow. And one of my jobs was, one of the very first things they did in Central Park was resod the sheep meadow and say, from now on, no more football or baseball or soccer here. And my job was to explain that to people. And because they did that, the sheep meadow now looks like this, and was the very first place, really in any park in New York, with beautiful green grass, where you could let your baby crawl and not worry the baby was going to eat a needle or a piece of broken glass. And it was this very important symbolic civic gesture that led to all the successes that followed in New York City parks. And the birth of the Central Park Conservancy begat these other conservancies. These are just New York City park conservancies. So they are park-specific. In some cases, there are some very robust citywide parks organizations. New Yorkers for Parks, Dave was talking about these organizations focused on park advocacy in general. That's what New Yorkers for Parks is. But the rest of those are conservancies or public-private partnerships that together raise about $150 million annually in private money to augment what the city spends, which is about $400 million annually just in the expense budget. So it's like having a 1/3 increase in your budget, having that private money coming in. And there are many different kinds of partnerships. These are just some of the partnership structures that I had as Parks Commissioner in New York City. Public sector partnerships, that is like public-public, so New York City with New York State, with the federal government, and getting grants from those various entities. And then you had sort of private sector partnerships with private operators like concessionaires who operate things, and access agreements. There's a great tool in New York City called the waterfront zoning text, which requires that anybody building anything new on the waterfront has to build a new waterfront park adjacent to their property, open to the public, at their own expense, and pay in perpetuity for its maintenance, often paying the city to maintain it, according to city design guidelines. And you think, why would anybody agree to that? Well, they don't have a choice. If they want to turn that old warehouse into a 40-story tower, they must build this public access waterfront park. Otherwise, go ahead and keep your warehouse. So that's a really important tool. And then these sort of nonprofit partnerships with things like conservancies. And here you can see sort of a spectrum of conservancy agreements, from just a friends organization, and in New York City, half of the parks have a friends group. What do? They literally have a bake sale. They might clean and paint and have volunteer cleanups, to some sort of management entities, to a conservancy that might do programming like movies in the parks or arts in the parks, to management agreements. The Central Park Conservancy manages Central Park on behalf of the City of New York. It has a management agreement, a contractual relationship. It raises $30 million a year, and the city contributes about $6 million a year. And then complete management by a nonprofit. So Bryant Park and other parks are completely managed by nonprofit business improvement districts or other nonprofits. They derive revenue from the park, but no tax dollars at all go into them. So there's this range of different kinds of public-private schemes, as they say, and I don't mean in the bad way, but a good way, for improving the management and appearance and the upkeep and the renovation of parks. So here are some of the best practices. I'd allow you to feast your eyes on these. I'm just going to highlight a few of them. If you're thinking about public-private partnerships, first of all, it takes a leap of faith. It takes a leap of faith from both partners. It's kind of like a marriage. And you have to, each side has to give to get. That's one of the most important things. There has to be trust and communication. You have to be in it for the long haul. One of the most important things is a formal agreement. There should be some kind of a formal agreement that lays out the rights and responsibilities. Also, if you are on the private side of that, you must reserve some seats on your board for actual voting board members who are public officials. Very important, because otherwise the public officials, if things go wrong, will say, oh, that terrible conservancy, I never wanted that. You want to be able to say, well, you're on the board, and you really want that public input. I was the public side of the public-private partnership. I had to take a leap of faith continuously and say, I'm going to give a little bit of hegemony to this private group. Also, we'll look at some other rules or ideas. You should have a master plan. It's very important to have a master plan, both for programs and renovations and things like that. There should be a board of directors. Consider allowing concessions and earned revenue to flow to that conservancy. That was another leap of faith we took. Not all conservancies, but some conservancies around the country get to keep the revenue that they generate in the park and put it back into the park. That happens in the High Line, for example. There's no public money going into the maintenance of the High Line. Make sure you have a maintenance plan for it, so don't go ahead and spend a lot of money on a capital project without remembering how you're going to maintain it. And just remember this, the final authority has to lie with the public. The rules, the regulations, the enforcement, conservancies, nonprofit groups do not want to mess with making rules, enforcing rules. Leave that to the city. That's why they pay you the big bucks to figure that stuff out. So it's not just these big fancy conservancies in New York. We did another study. It's called Public Spaces, Private Money, also available at our website. And here's one of the many tables in it, which looks at annual revenue for selected conservancies across the country. So you can see there's a great variation from 30 million or more in annual revenue down to just a few hundred thousand. But all of it, it's all scalable, and all of it makes a difference. And you can read this report, this Public Spaces, Private Money, which looks at the good, the bad, and the ugly, and again lays out some of the principles. So one case study of a great public-private partnership, again, a little bit of product placement. The old abandoned rail line, we're getting back to abandoned rail lines. This was a freight rail line in Chicago known as the Bloomingdale Line. Ran 3 miles through north central Chicago in a neighborhood that almost completely lacked parks. And the neighbors said, hey, we'd love to see this turned into a trail or greenway. They weren't getting a lot of traction. They turned to the Trust for Public Lands, and we got involved and helped them, and got involved with something known as the Bloomingdale Trail, later as the 606. So here you can see the Bloomingdale line, and it's when it was the before picture. And here's where you can see where it runs across north central Chicago. And then it really kind of got fast-tracked, if you excuse the expression, particularly when both Mayor Daley and then his successor, Mayor Emanuel said, I want to cut the ribbon on this thing, and really fast-tracked it. It's a $100 million, about a $90 million project with about $40 million coming from the private sector. And the city built it. So it's this terrific new amenity in north central Chicago. These are some of the renderings. This was again done by Michael Van Valkenburg Associates, my favorite landscape architect. So these are the designs from 2013. We're still in the rendering and design stage in 2013, and this is when it opened 2 years ago. So it took 2 years from design to completion, which is extraordinarily fast. It helps to have a mayor saying, hey, get this thing done. And there's Mayor Emanuel in the top left in the middle, cutting the ribbon, and the opening day celebrations, which was really a fantastic day. So just a few takeaways, sort of generic takeaways from this. I think you can all read. Just like to, again, emphasize, you really have to give to get. Both sides of the equation in a public-private partnership need to take that leap of faith and give to get. Let's all emphasize the multiple benefits of parks. And by the way, look for OPM. You know what OPM is, Ann? Other people's money, other agencies. All those agencies, like the Water Department, the Transportation Department, where money floods in from the federal government, find that money. It's in there. They need to spend it. The stormwater capture money. Community engagement is really difficult. It's not easy. Well, sometimes it's easy, but it's often very difficult. It's actually absolutely fundamental to any project. The new frontier in urban park creation, particularly in places like Calgary and Toronto, is going to be in repurposing other land. It's not just other people's money, but other people's land. There isn't land sitting around saying, future park. There's land sitting around saying abandoned rail line, former wharf, municipal dump, a big thing with turning garbage sanitary landfills, not garbage dumps, into parks. We're doing a 2,000-acre one in New York City. And I'll leave you with this. The final thing we think about, I've talked about all the sort of the reasons for having parks, health and real estate values and so on. The need for beauty in cities, and that's the intangible. It's hard to measure beauty, but you know it when you see it. And really strive for good design. And I've learned through my life that good design is no more expensive than bad design, and we've seen a lot of badly designed parks, and really push for those good designers to come in, really push to promote the landscape architects of Canada. The landscape architects are the new heroes in terms of city planning. They're the leaders of city planning because they think in terms of systems, not in terms of objects in the landscape. So really push for that element of beauty, because as Jim Corner said, if it's not beautiful, don't bother designing it. Thank you very much.